light in the garden was different. It wasn't like the light we know now, a thing that comes from a single, hot source in the sky, casting sharp shadows and bleaching the color from things at midday. No, the light in Eden was something you could almost breathe. It seemed to emanate from everything at once, from the petals of flowers that had not yet learned to wilt, from the impossibly green blades of grass, from the very air itself. It was a soft, pearlescent glow that wrapped around every leaf and stone, leaving no harsh edges, no dark corners where fear could fester. In the beginning, before the mistake, there was no need for such corners. Adam knew this light as he knew the beat of his own heart. It was the first thing he had ever seen, a gentle welcome into a world made just for him. He would often lie on his back in the long grass by the river Pishon, whose waters ran over beds of gold and bdellium, and simply watch the light play through the leaves of the sycamore trees. The sound of the world then was a perfect symphony. The river didn't rush. It flowed with a sound like a contented sigh. The birds didn't just chirp. They sang complex melodies that intertwined and harmonized, never competing, always complementing. The lowing of the great aurochs in the distance was not a bellow, but a deep, resonant note that seemed to anchor the world in peace. His days were filled with a kind of joyful purpose, a work that was not toil. Tending the garden was less a chore and more a conversation. He would walk among the groves, his bare feet pressing into the cool, damp earth, and feel the life of the place surging up to meet him. He would gently prune a branch from a fig tree, not because it was overgrown or dying, for nothing died, but to encourage it to fruit more abundantly. The tree seemed to thank him for it, its leaves rustling in a particular way that he had come to understand. He knew every plant, every vine, every flowering bush. He knew the precise moment a pomegranate was at its most perfect, the ruby-red seeds within plump with sweet juice. He knew the heft of a melon in his hands and the crisp snap of an apple plucked fresh from the bough. His relationship with the animals was one of innocent dominion. When the Creator had brought them before him, it had been the most marvelous parade imaginable. He remembered the lion, its mane not a fearsome display, but a magnificent, soft ruff that he had buried his face in. The creature had rumbled, a deep purr that vibrated through Adam's entire being. He had looked into its golden eyes and seen no predatory gleam, only a calm, steady intelligence. He had called him Ari, the strong one. He remembered the elephant, vast and gray, its skin a landscape of gentle wrinkles. It had knelt before him, lowering its great head, and he had laughed, a sound that was new and delightful to his own ears as he named it Ganesh for its wisdom. He had named the eagle Nesher for its soaring flight, and the dolphin Delphinus for its playful leaps in the waters of the Jihan. Each name was a discovery, a recognition of the essence of the creature before him. And they knew him. They would come to his call, not with the caution or servility of a tamed beast, but with the gladness of a friend. The wolf would lie down with the lamb, because the wolf had no thought of hunger that could not be sated by the sweet gourds that grew on the vine. no concept of fear. This was Adam's world, a perfect harmony of light, sound, purpose, and companionship with all of creation. And yet, in the heart of all this perfection, there was a space. It was not a loneliness as we would understand it, not an ache or a sorrow. It was more like an unfinished melody, a chord waiting for its final, resolving note. He could speak with the creatures, and they with him in their way, but there was a depth of understanding, a mirroring of his own soul that was absent. He spoke of this, not in complaint, but in simple observation, to the one who walked with him in the cool of the day. The presence of God in the garden was not a terrifying, awesome spectacle. It was as natural as the setting of the sun that never truly set, but merely softened into a twilight of indigo and rose. It was a voice, a feeling, a profound sense of being known and loved completely. "It is not good that the man should be alone," the voice had said, a sound that was both thunder and a whisper at once. And Adam had felt a deep peace settle over him, a trust so absolute it left no room for question. He had been put into a sleep, a slumber deeper than any night's rest. It was not a state of unconsciousness, but a different kind of awareness, a dream state where he felt a strange, painless parting from his own side. He felt, rather than saw, a delicate architecture of bone and flesh being drawn from him. And instead of loss, he felt an overwhelming sense of completion. When he awoke, the world had changed. The light was still the same, the air still as sweet, but the symphony had its final note. She was there. Her name was Eve, Chava, the mother of all living, though the concept of motherhood was as abstract then as the concept of death. To Adam, she was Isha, woman, for she was taken from Ish, man. But she was more than a counterpart. She was a revelation. She had his form, yet it was different, softer, a landscape of curves where he was one of angles. Her hair was a cascade of darkness against the brilliant green of the ferns where she lay. When she opened her eyes, he felt as if he were seeing his own soul reflected back at him for the first time. Their life together was a shared discovery. They explored the garden hand in hand, seeing it anew through each other's eyes. "Look, Adam," Eve would say, her voice like the chiming of small silver bells. "The way the dew has gathered on the spider's web, it holds the light like 1,000 tiny suns." And Adam, who had seen the web 100 times, would look again and see its intricate, breathtaking beauty as if for the first time. He would show her how to coax the sweetest nectar from the heart of the hibiscus flower, and she would weave its blossoms into his hair, laughing as he sneezed from the pollen. Were naked, and they felt no shame. How could they? Shame is a child of comparison and fear, and they had neither. Nakedness was simply their state of being, as natural as the fur on the bear or the feathers on the swan. Their bodies were a source of joy and wonder, not of concealment. They knew each other completely, their thoughts as open to one another as their physical forms. There were no secrets, no hidden chambers in the heart. Their love was as pure and unfiltered as the water they drank from the cool springs. In the center of this idyllic existence, in the very heart of the garden, stood 2 trees. They were set apart, not by a fence or a wall, but by an aura of significance. One was the tree of life, its leaves a vibrant, shimmering silver green, its fruit pulsing with a gentle, internal luminescence. Its purpose was simple. To eat of it was to live forever in this perfect state. They ate of it freely, its taste like honey and sunlight, sustaining their unending youth. The other tree was different. It was beautiful, just as beautiful as any other tree in the garden. Its trunk was smooth and dark, its leaves a deep, glossy green. Its fruit was a marvel to behold, a color that seemed to hold all colors within it, shifting from ruby red to sunset orange to deep violet depending on how the light struck it. It was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and of this tree there was a single, simple command, a rule in a world without rules. You may surely eat of every tree of the garden, the Creator had told Adam, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die. Death, the word held no real meaning for them. How could it? It was like trying to describe darkness to someone who has only ever known light. They understood it only as a negation of what they had. This life, this joy, this communion. It was the ultimate no in a world of yes. The command was not a burden, it was a boundary, a single point of reference in a universe of freedom. It was the one and only way they could express their trust, their love, their willing obedience to the one who had given them everything. To not eat was their daily act of worship, their simple thank you for paradise. For a time that cannot be measured in our days or years, this was enough. They would walk past the tree, admire its beauty, acknowledge the command, and walk on, their hands intertwined, their hearts untroubled. The fruit was beautiful, yes, but so was the fruit of 1,000 other trees. The knowledge it promised was an abstraction. Why would they need to know evil in a world where it did not exist? Why would they need to understand good as a concept when it was the very substance of their reality? The command was not a temptation. It was just a fact, until the day it wasn't. The serpent was not a creature they feared. In the beginning, it was the most subtle, the most clever of all the beasts of the field. It was not a slithering, ground-hugging thing of our modern revulsion. It was magnificent. Its scales were like a mosaic of emeralds and jade, catching the Edenic light in 1,000 glittering facets. It moved with a fluid grace that was mesmerizing to watch, and when it spoke, its voice was not a hiss, but a smooth, persuasive whisper, like the rustling of leaves in a summer breeze. It was beautiful, intelligent, and a part of the harmony of the garden. They had no reason to distrust it. Eve was near the center of the garden, alone for a moment. Perhaps she was examining the intricate spiral pattern on a snail's shell, or watching a hummingbird, a living jewel, hover before a trumpet flower. Adam was on the other side of a small, clear stream, cataloging a new variety of orchid he had just discovered. They were not far apart, but for that moment, she was in her own world of quiet contemplation. The serpent drew near, its movements so silent she didn't notice it, until it was coiled loosely on a low-hanging branch of a nearby acacia. It didn't startle her. Nothing did. She simply turned her curious gaze upon it, and "Has God truly said?" the serpent began, its voice a silken thread weaving into the quiet air, "that you must not eat from any tree in the garden." The question was a masterpiece of misdirection. It was an exaggeration, a caricature of the truth designed to be easily corrected. It invited her into a dialogue. It positioned the Creator's command as something unreasonable, something restrictive and total. Eve, honest and guileless, felt the need to correct the falsehood. "Oh no," she said, perhaps with a small, gentle laugh at the absurdity of the question. "We may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden. It is only about the fruit of the tree in the middle of the garden that God has said, 'You shall not eat of it, nor shall you touch it, lest you die.'" Her addition, "nor shall you touch it," was the first tiny crack. It was her own embroidery on the command, a small fence she had built around the rule, perhaps out of an abundance of caution. But in that small addition was the seed of legalism, the beginning of a shift from a relationship of trust to a negotiation of rules. The serpent saw the opening, the tiny wobble in her perfect certainty. "You will not surely die," the serpent whispered, and the words fell into the air with a shocking finality. It was the first direct contradiction of the Creator she had ever heard. The first no to God's no. The world should have shuddered. The birds should have fallen silent. But nothing happened. The light remained soft. The air remained sweet. The serpent's statement just hung there, an alternative reality now presented as a possibility. Eve's mind, which had always been a clear pool, was now stirred. A ripple of confusion spread through her. Not die, but the Creator had said. It was a direct conflict between two sources. One was the voice of God, the foundation of her entire existence. The other was the voice of this beautiful, persuasive creature, a creature God Himself had made. The serpent pressed its advantage, moving from contradiction to motivation, a far more insidious poison. "For God knows," it continued, its voice dropping to a conspiratorial, intimate tone, "that in the day you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." This was the core of the temptation. It wasn't just about a piece of fruit. It was about status. It was about secret knowledge. It was about suspicion. God knows. The phrase was a dagger. It implied that God was withholding something. Her benefactor, the giver of all good things, was suddenly cast in a new, unfamiliar light. As a gatekeeper, a cosmic miser, hoarding the best for himself. The one restriction, which had seemed so reasonable and small, now loomed large, a symbol of her supposed inferiority. Your eyes will be opened. This was a tantalizing promise. Weren't her eyes already open? She could see the beauty of the garden, the love in Adam's face. What more was there to see? The serpent's words suggested a different kind of sight, a deeper perception, a hidden layer of reality she was currently blind to. It hinted her current state of innocence was actually a state of ignorance. You will be like God. This was the ultimate lure, like God. Not just a creature, however beloved, but a peer. To possess the same knowledge, the same understanding. To what end? To judge, to create. The possibilities, undefined and vast, bloomed in her imagination. The desire was not for a specific power, but for the elevation itself. To close that gap between the created and the creator, knowing good and evil. The phrase, once an abstraction, now sounded like a treasure. To know, to understand the full spectrum of existence. Was her current goodness not true goodness because she did not know its opposite? Was her innocence a form of weakness? The serpent's logic was a twisting, compelling vine wrapping itself around her simple trust. She turned and looked at the tree, really looked at it for the first time through the filter of the serpent's words. Before, it had been the tree of the commandment. Now, it was the tree of possibility. She saw that the tree was good for food. Her gaze lingered on the fruit. It did look succulent, perfect. Its skin was flawless, gleaming with a vitality that seemed to surpass the other fruits. A sudden, sharp hunger, a desire she had never felt before, not for sustenance, but for this specific object, pricked at her. It was a craving born not of the body, but of the soul. She saw that it was a delight to the eyes. Its beauty was no longer just a fact of the landscape. It was an allure. The shifting colors seemed to beckon her, to promise secrets within its vibrant flesh. It was beautiful in a way that made her feel lacking, as if possessing its beauty would transfer some of its quality to her, and she saw that the tree was desirable to make one wise. This was the deepest pull: wisdom, knowledge, to transcend her current state, to see what God saw, to know what God knew. The serpent's suggestion that God was holding back this wisdom for selfish reasons now seemed plausible. The command no longer felt like a loving boundary for her protection, but a jealous restriction on her potential. The symphony of the garden began to fade into the background. The gentle flow of the Pishon, the song of the larks, the rustle of the leaves, all of it became a dull hum. The universe, for Eve, shrank to this single point: her, the serpent's whisper, and the fruit. Her heart, once a steady, calm rhythm, began to beat faster. It was a new sensation, a flutter of anxiety and excitement. This was her choice, not Adam's, not God's, hers. The very idea was intoxicating. In a world of perfect provision, the opportunity to take something for herself was a novel and powerful drug. She thought of God's warning, "You shall surely die." But what did it mean? The serpent, so confident, so beautiful, had said she would not. And it was still alive. It had this knowledge, seemingly, and it had not been struck down. Perhaps death was not a cessation of being, but a metaphor. Perhaps it meant the death of her current, simple self, to be reborn as something more. A goddess. She reached out her hand. The movement felt slow, deliberate, as if she were moving through water. Her fingers, which had only ever known the feel of soft petals and smooth bark, brushed against the warm, vibrant skin of the fruit. No lightning bolt flashed from the sky. No thunder cracked. The branch did not recoil. The serpent watched, its unblinking eyes like polished stones. She closed her hand around it. The fruit felt solid, real in her grasp. It was heavier than she expected, weighted with destiny. She twisted it gently, and with a soft snap, it came away from the branch. The act was done. The boundary was crossed. She had touched it, and she had not died. A wave of triumph washed over her. The serpent was right. God was wrong, or at least not entirely truthful. The fear began to recede, replaced by a giddy sense of power. She lifted the fruit to her lips. The scent was intoxicating, a complex aroma of honey, spice, and something else, something wild and unknown. She hesitated for a final, fleeting second. A flicker of the old world, the world of simple trust and uncomplicated love, flashed before her eyes. Adam's smiling face, the feeling of the Creator's presence in the cool of the day, but the promise of wisdom, of being like God, was too strong. She took a bite. The flesh of the fruit was crisp, and an explosion of flavor filled her mouth. It was a taste beyond anything she had ever known, a complex medley of sweet and tart, with an undertone she couldn't identify, something metallic and sharp. For a moment, there was just the sensory experience. The taste, the texture, the juice running down her chin, and then the change. It wasn't a flash of light. It was a flash of darkness. An opening, yes, but not into light. Her eyes were opened to a new dimension, the dimension of self. For the first time, she was truly aware of Eve as a separate entity, distinct not just from Adam and the animals, but from God. And this new awareness was not empowering. It was terrifyingly isolating. Knowledge flooded her, but it was not the grand, cosmic wisdom she had imagined. She knew good, yes, she knew it now as the memory of what she had just lost. It was a phantom limb, an aching void where the peace and communion used to be. And she knew evil, oh, she knew evil intimately, for it was coiling in her own gut. It was the shame that was beginning to burn on her cheeks. It was the fear that was a cold knot in her stomach. It was the bitter taste of regret that overwhelmed the sweetness of the fruit. She looked at her own hands, the hands that had taken the fruit, and they seemed alien to her, the hands of a stranger. She looked around the garden, and it was transformed. The soft light now seemed to mock her, illuminating her new, raw state of being. The flowers were still beautiful, but their beauty was now a judgment on her ugliness. The songs of the birds sounded shrill and chaotic. She was naked. The simple fact of her body, once a source of innocent joy, was now a source of profound vulnerability and shame. She felt exposed, seen in a way she had never been before, not by a loving creator, but by a new, harsh, internal critic. Her first thought was not of God. It was of Adam. She could not bear this alone. This new, terrible knowledge, this crushing weight of self-awareness. It was too much for one soul to hold. She had to share it. Misery, she discovered in that instant, does not love solitude. It craves company. She needed him to be in this new, fallen world with her. If he remained in the light, his innocence would be a searing indictment of her guilt every moment of every day. She needed him to be like her. She found him by the stream, his back to her, still engrossed in the delicate, spotted petals of the orchid. He turned as he heard her approach, a smile already forming on his face, a smile that shattered her heart. It was the smile from before. He didn't know. "Adam," she said, and her voice sounded strange to her own ears, thin and strained. He saw the fruit in her hand, the bite taken from it. His smile vanished. A look of utter confusion crossed his face. He looked from the fruit to her eyes, and for the first time, he could not read them. They were shadowed, guarded. "Eve, what have you done?" he asked, his voice low and filled with a dawning dread. "I have eaten," she said, trying to keep her voice steady, trying to inject it with the same excitement and promise the serpent had used on her. "The serpent, it told me the truth. Our eyes are opened. We can be like God. I can see everything now." She held the fruit out to him. "You must eat too, so you can see." Adam stared at the fruit. He was not deceived. The Bible is clear on this point. He had heard the command from God directly. He had not been subjected to the serpent's clever, twisting logic. He knew with absolute certainty that this was the one thing he was not to do. He knew the price was death. He looked at the fruit, then back at Eve, and he saw it. He saw the change in her. He saw the fear she was trying to hide behind a mask of bravado. He saw the shame in the way she held her other hand across her body. He saw that she had already crossed over into a different country, a land of shadow from which she could not return. The Eve he had known just moments before, the Eve of perfect, shared innocence, was gone. His mind reeled. The choice before him was stark and terrible. He could obey God, refuse the fruit, and remain in the light. But he would be alone again, utterly alone. Eve, his other half, his very bone and flesh, would be what? Cast out, destroyed. He could not bear the thought. To live forever in a perfect garden without her would be a hollow, meaningless existence. The chord would be broken forever, the melody left eternally unresolved. Or he could eat. He could disobey God, the source of his life, and all that was good. He could knowingly and willingly step out of the light and into the shadow with her. He could choose her over God. It was a choice between his creator and his companion, between obedience and love, or at least what he perceived as love. His love for her, his inability to imagine life without her, overwhelmed his love and reverence for God. It was the first and most catastrophic codependent decision in human history. He was not tricked by a promise of wisdom. He was crippled by a fear of loss. He looked at her eyes, swimming with a terror she could no longer conceal, and his resolve crumbled. He would not let her go into the darkness alone. With a heavy heart, a heart that already felt the cold chill of the coming death, he took the fruit from her hand. He did not savor it. He did not delight in its beauty. He looked at it as a man might look at a cup of poison he knows he must drink. He raised it to his lips, and with a sense of grim finality, he bit down. The flavor was ashes in his mouth, and his eyes were opened. The crushing weight that had descended upon Eve now fell on him, doubled. He saw his own nakedness and the nakedness of his wife, and for the first time, it was a source of mutual shame. The open, innocent communion between them was shattered, replaced by a new and terrible trinity: fear, accusation, and blame. He looked at Eve, and in his gaze, there was no longer just love, but the first flicker of resentment. "You did this." She looked back at him, and in her eyes, there was no longer just shared discovery, but a desperate plea. "You are in this with me." The idyllic harmony of the garden was gone, not with a bang, but with the sickening silence of a broken string. The vibrant colors seemed to fade to a dull gray. The air grew heavy, thick with an unspoken dread. They were exposed. They were vulnerable. They were ashamed. Frantically, they looked for something, anything, to cover themselves. They saw a large fig tree, its leaves broad and stiff. They tore at them, their hands clumsy and shaking. They tried to stitch them together using thorns as needles and thin vines as thread, creating crude, pathetic loincloths. It was the first human invention, born not of creativity, but of shame. An utterly useless attempt to hide their new inner reality by covering their outer physical forms. And then they heard it. It was a sound they had always loved, a sound that had always brought them running with joyful hearts. It was the sound of the evening breeze stirring the leaves, the sound that always heralded the approach of their Creator, coming to walk with them. But now, the sound filled them with a cold, primal terror they had never known. The familiar sound of love had become the terrifying footstep of judgment. The voice that had named them was now the voice they most wanted to escape. There was nowhere to run. There was nowhere to hide. But they tried. They scrambled into the dense thicket of trees, crouching behind the bushes, their hearts pounding in their chests. Adam, the master of the garden, and Eve, the mother of all living, were now just two frightened, hiding creatures, holding their breath in the sudden twilight of their own making, waiting for the inevitable question they knew was coming. The silence in the thicket was absolute, a heavy blanket woven from fear and shame. Adam and Eve crouched, their makeshift fig leaf coverings feeling utterly ridiculous, a child's game against the encroaching reality. Every rustle of a leaf, every snap of a twig, sounded like a thunderclap in the charged atmosphere. The sound they had once longed for, the sound of God walking in the cool of the day, was now the footfall of their doom. It grew closer, a gentle, rhythmic presence that their new, terrified hearts could not bear. "Adam, where are you?" The voice was not a roar of fury. That might have been easier to withstand. It was a question, soft and laced with a sorrow so profound, it seemed to make the very air weep. It was the question of a father who already knows the answer, but must hear it from the child's own lips. The question of a lover whose heart is breaking. Adam, the man who had stood proudly and named the beasts, felt his own name now as a brand of shame. He couldn't stay hidden. The attempt was futile. Slowly, stiffly, he rose from his hiding place, pulling a trembling Eve with him. They stood in a small clearing, blinking in the soft light, feeling utterly, spiritually naked. "I heard your voice in the garden," Adam stammered, his own voice a stranger to him, rough and choked. "And I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid myself." The dreadful, simple logic of it hung in the air. Fear, a brand new emotion in the lexicon of creation. And it was born of his nakedness, a state that had, until this moment, been as natural as breathing. The Creator's response was another gentle, prodding question, designed to lead them to confession. "Who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree of which I commanded you not to eat?" There it was, the moment of truth, a chance for simple confession, for yes, I have. But the poison of the fruit was already at work, twisting the soul. Its primary symptom was the death of responsibility. Adam, in his fear, did the second thing that all fallen people do. He looked for someone else to blame. "The woman," he said, the words tasting like ash. He might not have even pointed, but the accusation was as sharp as a spear. "The woman whom you gave to be with me, she gave me fruit of the tree, and I ate." It was a master class in blame shifting. In one sentence, he implicated Eve, his beloved, and subtly, devastatingly, he implicated God himself. "The woman you gave me, it was your fault for giving her to me in the first place." The perfect union was fractured, replaced by accusation. The gaze, for it was more than a look, turned to Eve. Her shame was doubled now, bearing the weight of her own transgression and Adam's betrayal. "What is this that you have done?" The voice asked her again, not with rage, but with a deep, wounded sorrow. And Eve, following the pattern, passed the blame down the line. "The serpent deceived me, and I ate." It was true, of course, but it was a half-truth that evaded the core of her own choice, her own desire, her own willing participation. The consequences, when they came, were not bolts of lightning, but the sad, inevitable reshaping of reality around their new, broken nature. The serpent was cursed to crawl on its belly, a physical manifestation of its debased nature, forever an emblem of the enmity it had sown. Eve, the mother, would find that the process of bringing forth life, Chava, would be bound up with pain and sorrow, and her relationship with her husband would be marred by a new and complex dynamic of desire and rule. Adam, the tender of the garden, would now fight the very ground he once conversed with. Thorns and thistles would resist him. He would eat his bread only by the sweat of his brow, his work transformed from joyful purpose to wearying toil. And for both of them, the final, dreadful promise was fulfilled. "For you are dust, and to dust you shall return." Death, once an incomprehensible word, was now their certain destination. They were clothed by God, not in flimsy leaves, but in skins. The first death, an animal, an innocent part of the perfect creation had to die to cover their shame. It was a somber, terrible gift, a foreshadowing of a principle they could not yet understand. That covering sin required the shedding of blood, and then the final heartbreaking act. They were exiled. They were led to the eastern gate of the garden, their home, their world. Adam looked back one last time at the soft light, at the river flowing over beds of gold, at the trees whose fruit he would never taste again. Eve wept, not loud, racking sobs, but a silent, continuous stream of tears that tracked paths through the dust, already gathering on her face. They were driven out, and behind them at the gate was placed the cherubim, beings of indescribable majesty, and a sword of flame that turned every way, a whirling, impassable vortex of fire to guard the way to the tree of life. Paradise was lost. The world outside the garden was beautiful, but it was a wild, untamed beauty. The sun was harsher here. The wind had a biting edge. The ground was hard, rocky, and unforgiving. The plants grew, but they grew with a desperate, competitive vigor, choking one another out. The animals were different too. There was a watchfulness in their eyes, a new tension. The law of love had been replaced by the law of tooth and claw. The world was no longer a garden, it was a wilderness. Into this new world, this world of toil and sorrow, of memory and regret, a new hope was born. Eve conceived and bore a son. She held the tiny, squirming infant in her arms, looked into his face, and for the first time since the exile, a genuine, unreserved joy broke through her sorrow. She laughed, a sound Adam had not heard in a long, long time. "I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord," she exclaimed. She named him Cain, which means acquired or gotten. In her heart, a desperate hope bloomed. Could this be him? Could this be the one? The promised seed, spoken of in the curse upon the serpent, who would one day crush the enemy's head and perhaps lead them back home. This tiny child was not just her son, he was her hope for redemption. Adam looked at his son with a mixture of awe and trepidation. This was the first human being born, not created, born into a fallen world under a harsher sky. He taught Cain the ways of this new world. He taught him how to read the seasons, how to find water, how to distinguish edible plants from poisonous ones. But most importantly, he and Eve taught him the stories of the garden. They spoke of the perfect light, of the talking animals, of the gentle voice in the cool of the day. And they spoke of their mistake. It was a cautionary tale, a family liturgy of loss. For Cain, the Garden of Eden was not a memory, it was a myth, a bedtime story of a perfect world he had never known, lost because of a mistake he couldn't fully comprehend. The flaming sword at the eastern gate was a real, tangible barrier, a place they perhaps visited from a distance, a constant, shimmering reminder of what his parents had forfeited. Sometime later, another son was born. This time, there was less fanfare. The novelty of birth had passed. They named him Abel, a name that hauntingly means breath, vapor, or futility. Was it a reflection of their dwindling hope, their resignation to the long, hard reality of their exile? Or was it simply a name that sounded right to them? We don't know, but the names would prove to be prophetic. The two boys grew up in the shadow of the lost paradise. They were as different as the sun and the moon. Cain, the firstborn, was earthy and robust. He was his father's son, drawn to the soil. He felt the curse of the ground in his very bones. He wrestled with the earth, tearing a living from it with his bare hands, and the crude tools they fashioned from wood and stone. His hands were calloused, his back strong, his face perpetually sunburnt. He was a man of sweat and effort. Tilling the ground was his reality. Every weed he pulled, every rock he cleared, was a battle. His successes were hard-won, his failures frequent. He would watch a promising crop wither under a hot sun or be devoured by locusts, and a quiet, simmering resentment would build in his heart. A resentment for this stubborn, cursed ground. Abel was different. He was quieter, more contemplative. He was drawn not to the stubborn earth, but to the breathing, moving life of the flocks. While Cain fought the ground, Abel nurtured his animals. He became a keeper of sheep. His work was not one of violent struggle, but of patient guidance. He led his flocks to green pastures, what few there were, and to still waters. He protected them from predators, his staff and his sling his only tools. He spent long hours under the vast, open sky, watching the clouds drift by day and the silent, wheeling stars by night. In the quiet solitude of the fields, surrounded by the gentle bleating of his sheep, he developed a different kind of relationship with the unseen God of his parents' stories. While Cain's work tied him to the cursed earth, Abel's work lifted his eyes to the heavens. He saw the Creator's hand, not in a lost paradise, but in the miracle of a newborn lamb, in the faithfulness of the sunrise, in the constellations that his father had begun to name. The brothers loved each other in the way that brothers do. They worked together, shared their meals of roasted grain and goat's milk, and slept near the same fire. But their different natures created a subtle, unspoken distance between them. Cain, the pragmatist, might have seen his brothers shepherding as a less demanding life. Abel, the gentle soul, might have been troubled by the constant, low-grade anger that seemed to emanate from his older brother. The day came, in the course of time, when they both felt the need to formalize their relationship with the God they had only ever known through stories. They would bring an offering, a gift, an act of worship. This was a pivotal moment, the first recorded act of worship by the children of Adam. Cain went first. He surveyed his fields, the product of his sweat and toil. He gathered up some of the fruit of the soil, some grain, perhaps some vegetables, some fruit. The scripture is simple. Cain brought an offering to the Lord of the fruit of the ground. There is no mention of quality. It doesn't say he brought the first fruits or the best of his harvest. It was just some of it. One can almost picture him wiping the sweat from his brow, gathering a portion of his crop with a sense of duty, perhaps even of grudging obligation. Here, I worked for this. This is my due. This is what the ground gave me, and this is what I give back. His heart, we can imagine, was filled not with joyful gratitude, but with the pride of his own labor. He was offering God the work of his own hands from the cursed ground. He built an altar of earth and stone, piled his offering upon it, and waited. Then came Abel. He went among his flocks. He didn't just grab the nearest sheep. The scripture is specific and beautiful in its detail. Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat portions. The firstborn, the most prized, the symbol of future hope and prosperity, and their fat portions, the richest, most succulent, the very best part. This was not an offering of duty, it was an offering of love. It was costly. It represented the best of all he had, a recognition that all he had ultimately came from the giver of life. His heart was not in the gift itself, but in the attitude of giving. It was an act of faith, of trust, of humble gratitude. He, too, built an altar, and in his offering there was the shedding of blood, a faint echo of the skins God had made for his parents, an unconscious acknowledgement of the great chasm that sin had opened between humanity and God. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering, he had no regard. How did they know? The text doesn't say. Perhaps a pillar of fire descended upon Abel's altar and consumed it, leaving Cain's untouched. Perhaps it was a quiet, internal confirmation, a sense of divine pleasure that filled Abel's heart, and a cold, echoing emptiness that met Cain's. However it was manifested, the result was unambiguous. Abel was accepted. Cain was rejected, and Cain became very angry, and his face fell. This is one of the most tragic and psychologically astute lines in all of Scripture. The anger was not just disappointment. It was a deep, searing rage born of perceived injustice. Why? Why him and not me? My work was harder. My struggle was greater. The anger was directed outward at God and at his brother. But the fallen face, the downcast countenance, that was shame. It was the humiliation of public rejection. He could not look his brother in the eye. He could not lift his face to the sky. His pride, which had been the foundation of his offering, was shattered. All the simmering resentment he felt for the cursed ground was now focused into a laser beam of hatred directed at the two beings who had revealed his inadequacy, God and Abel. Abel's simple, righteous existence was now an intolerable judgment upon him. In this moment of crisis, as Cain stood stewing in the toxic brew of his own anger and shame, God did not abandon him. He spoke to him, not with condemnation, but with a gentle, diagnostic care. He approached Cain as a loving counselor. Why are you angry? The question invited introspection. Look inside, Cain. Examine the root of this feeling. It's not about the offering. It's about your heart. And why has your face fallen? Why the shame? Are you ashamed of your offering or of the heart that gave it? Then came the prescription, the path back to acceptance. If you do well, will you not be accepted? The way was open. This was not a final rejection. He could try again. He could change his heart, correct his attitude, and find favor. The choice was his. And then a warning. a warning that echoes down through all of human history, a perfect diagnosis of the mechanics of sin. And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Sin personified. It's not just an act, it's a presence, a predator, a wild beast lying in wait, crouching like a lion in the tall grass, muscles tensed, ready to spring. Where is the door? It is the door of the human heart, the threshold of the will. Sin wants in. It waits for a moment of weakness, of anger, of envy. Its desire is for you, the Creator continued. Sin is not passive. It has an appetite. It desires to master you, to consume you, to own you. It wants to make you its slave. Cain could feel it, this dark, crouching thing, its hot breath on the back of his neck, its whispers echoing the rage in his own soul. But you must rule over it. This was the charge, the imperative. You are not helpless, Cain. You have been warned. You see the beast. You have been given dominion, just as your father was given dominion over the creatures of the earth. You have the capacity to say no, to stand up, to master this impulse, to turn away from the crouching darkness and walk back into the light of doing well. This was God's grace to Cain, a clear diagnosis, a path to restoration, and a stark warning. The choice was laid bare before him, but Cain did not listen. The voice of his wounded pride was louder than the voice of his Creator. The crouching beast was more compelling than the call to repentance. He let the anger fester. He let the envy take root and grow, a poisonous vine wrapping itself around his heart, choking out all reason, all love, all memory of brotherhood. He watched Abel. He saw his brother, his face still shining with the joy of his acceptance, moving among his sheep with that same infuriating gentleness. Abel's peace was a storm in Cain's soul. Abel's righteousness was a fire searing Cain's conscience. He could not bear it. Every bleat of Abel's sheep, every prayer Abel whispered to the heavens, was another twist of the knife in Cain's heart. The beast was no longer just crouching at the door. Cain had unlatched the bolt and invited it in. He made a plan. The anger and envy coalesced into a cold, hard purpose. He would remove the source of his shame. He would silence the walking judgment that was his brother. He approached Abel, his face a mask of normalcy, hiding the raging tempest within. "Let us go out to the field," he said. The words were simple, brotherly. Perhaps it was a common occurrence for them to walk together, to survey the land. Abel, his heart pure and his conscience clear, suspected nothing. He saw his brother, and he felt not fear, but perhaps a pang of pity for his rejection, a desire to comfort him. He readily agreed. They walked together, away from the small camp where their parents were, away from any watching eyes. They walked past the flocks of sheep, who perhaps grew nervous at the approach of Cain, sensing the predator he had become. They walked out into an empty field, a place of isolation. Perhaps Cain made small talk, pointing out a hawk circling high overhead, or the way the clouds were gathering on the horizon. All the while, the beast inside him was poised, waiting for the right moment. And when they were alone in the field, when Abel's back was turned, or when he was kneeling to examine a wildflower. Cain rose up against his brother, the first act of human murder. A brother's hand, which should have been there to help and protect, was raised to strike. We are not told the weapon. A heavy rock, perhaps, or the wooden handle of a farming tool. The instrument doesn't matter. What matters is the will behind it. The crashing blow, the cry of shock and pain from Abel, the look of utter betrayal in his eyes as he fell, and then silence. A profound, terrible silence in the empty field, broken only by Cain's own ragged breathing. The rage, which had been a roaring fire in his soul, was suddenly extinguished, leaving behind only the cold, gray ash of what he had done. He looked down at his brother, his Abel, his breath, lying still upon the ground. He saw the blood, the first human blood shed by human hands, seeping into the soil, the very soil Cain had cursed and fought. The ground, which had refused to give him its best, now drank the life of his brother. A new feeling, one he had not anticipated, overwhelmed him. Panic. The beast of sin, having been fed, was now a ravenous, insatiable monster of guilt and fear. He had to hide it. He had to pretend it didn't happen. He left his brother's body there in the lonely field and walked away, trying to compose his face, trying to scrub the image from his mind. But he could not escape the witness. The voice came again, not in a gentle whisper of counsel, but with a question that echoed across the desolate landscape, a question that has haunted murderers ever since. Where is Abel, your brother? It was the same question he had asked his father in the garden. Where are you? A question demanding accountability. A question that already knew the answer. Cain, now fully a citizen of the land of lies that his parents had discovered, responded with a surly, defiant shrug. A lie wrapped in a question. I do not know, he snapped, the words sharp with a false bravado. And then the infamous, chilling reply. Am I my brother's keeper? It was the anthem of the fallen world. The denial of responsibility, the rejection of community, the declaration of radical, selfish individualism. Yes, Cain, you were supposed to be your brother's keeper. That is the very essence of family, of humanity. And you have not just failed in your keeping, you have become his destroyer. The Creator's response was swift and terrible. There was no more gentle counsel. The time for that was over. What have you done? The voice was filled with a divine anguish. The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. The imagery is staggering. The very earth, which had been cursed because of Adam's sin, now had a voice. The innocent blood of Abel had given it a tongue to cry out for justice. Cain could not silence it. The blood cried out louder than his lies, louder than his defiance. It cried out to the heavens, and it was heard. And now the curse fell, not on the ground, but directly upon Cain himself. And now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. The partnership he had with the earth, however fraught, was now severed completely. When you work the ground, it shall no longer yield to you its strength. His life's work, His very identity as a tiller of the soil was rendered futile. The earth would actively resist him, reject him, as he had rejected his brother. And his punishment was not death, but something Cain may have found worse, a life of perpetual alienation. You shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. He would have no home, no place to rest, no community. He would be forever moving, forever an outcast, haunted by the memory of the silent field and the blood-soaked ground. The weight of the sentence crushed Cain's defiance, replacing it with a cry of despair. "My punishment is greater than I can bear," he cried out. He suddenly understood the totality of his isolation. "Behold, you have driven me today away from the ground, and from your face I shall be hidden." This was the true terror, to be hidden from the face of God, to be cut off from the source of all life and presence. He would be a wanderer, and in a world where everyone was kin, his crime would make him a target. "Anyone who finds me will kill me." But even here, in this moment of just sentencing, God extended a strange and mysterious mercy. He did not desire Cain's death at the hands of another. He put a mark on Cain. We don't know what it was, a sign, a tattoo, a light on his face. It was not a mark of shame, but a mark of divine protection. A do not touch sign from the Creator himself, promising a sevenfold vengeance on anyone who dared to harm him. And so Cain went away from the presence of the Lord. He journeyed east of Eden to the land of Nod, a name which means wandering. There, he tried to defy his sentence. The wanderer built a city. The man cursed from the ground fathered a lineage. His descendants would become skilled in metalworking, creating instruments of bronze and iron, tools that could be used for building, but also for violence. They would become masters of music, creating beautiful sounds on the harp and lyre. They would live in tents and raise livestock. They would build a civilization, a human-centered world, all born from the bitter root of that first act of envy. It was a civilization founded in the land of wandering, by a man hiding from the face of God, all because of a catastrophic mistake born from a rejected offering, and a heart that chose to feed the beast crouching at the door. The world after the murder was a world of echoes. The voice of Abel's blood crying from the ground never truly fell silent. It became a low hum beneath the surface of all things, a reminder of the fracture. Cain, the wanderer, carried his mark of strange protection into the land of Nod, and his descendants filled the world with their cleverness and their violence. They learned to forge bronze and iron, turning the bones of the earth into swords and plowshares, though more often swords. They learned to coax music from strings and pipes, creating melodies of great beauty that could not, however, soothe the restless, fearful heart of humanity. Generations passed like the turning of leaves. People multiplied, their numbers spreading across the continents. But as they multiplied, the memory of Eden grew dimmer, while the memory of the blood-soaked field seemed to grow stronger. The darkness that Cain had invited into his heart found welcome in the hearts of many. A strange and terrible union occurred, a mingling of the earthly and the celestial, and from it sprang a race of giants, men of renown whose greatness was measured in power and violence. the world became filled with a wickedness so profound, so complete, that it grieved the Creator to his very heart. The symphony of creation had devolved into a cacophony of corruption. And so the rains came. It was not a punishment of rage, but a cleansing of sorrow, a washing of the world, a return to the watery chaos of the beginning to start again. Only one man, Noah, who had found grace in the eyes of God, was saved. He and his family, sealed within a great ark of gopher, would along with the seed of all animal life. For 40 days and 40 nights, the world dissolved. When the waters finally receded and the door of the ark was opened, Noah and his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their wives stepped out into a world scrubbed clean. The silence must have been overwhelming. No cities, no clamor, no songs of the violent. Just the sigh of the wind over wet earth, the smell of damp soil and clean air, and the gentle sounds of the animals emerging into the new dawn. God made a promise then, a covenant sealed not with a command, but with a gift. He set his bow in the clouds, the first rainbow, a multicolored bridge of light. It was a promise that he would never again destroy the earth with a flood. The memory of the water would remain, but it would be framed by this ark of grace. And with the promise came the original command renewed: be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Go, spread out. Settle the valleys, climb the mountains, explore the coastlands. Be stewards of this new, clean world. Trust me, the water will not rise again. You are safe. For a time they did. They stayed together, one large family, their numbers slowly growing. They all spoke the same language, the original tongue of Adam, a language where words and things were perfectly aligned. Their thoughts were mutually intelligible, their commands instantly understood. They were one people, united by blood, by memory, and by speech. As they journeyed from the mountainous regions of Ararat, where the ark had rested, they traveled eastward. The land was lush and wild, and they moved as a single, nomadic body. But the memory of the flood was a shadow that walked with them. It was the great trauma of their ancestral line. They had God's promise, the rainbow, but a promise is an invisible thing, and the memory of the rising, world-swallowing water was a terrifyingly vivid one. A fear began to take root in their collective heart, a fear of being scattered, of being alone and vulnerable in the vast emptiness of the new world. What if another catastrophe came? If they were scattered, they would be helpless. Their unity was their strength, their only perceived defense against a world that had once turned so violently against their ancestors. This fear led them to a particular place, a plain in the land of Shinar, the fertile crescent between the great rivers Tigris and Euphrates. It was perfect. It was flat, wide, and open. The soil was rich, dark river clay. There was no place to hide here, but there was also no place for danger to hide from them. It was a place where they could all live together, see one another, and build something permanent. It was here they decided to stop their wandering. It was here they decided to defy the command to fill the earth. They would stay here, together. The spirit of this generation was one of remarkable ingenuity and self-reliance. They had seen the fragility of life. They had heard the stories of a world destroyed. Their response was not to lean on the God who had saved them, but to take matters into their own hands. They would build a world that could not be washed away. They would create their own security, and they made a technological breakthrough that changed everything. The land of Shinar had no stone for building, only endless mud and clay. In other places, their ancestors had built with rough-hewn rocks or sun-dried mud bricks that would crumble in the rain. But someone in Shinar had a revolutionary idea. Come, the idea spread like fire through the camp. Let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. It's hard for us to grasp the magnitude of this. Here in Da Nang, I see concrete being poured and steel skeletons rising into the humid air every day, and we think nothing of it. But for them, the fired brick was a miracle of engineering. They dug up the rich clay, mixed it with water and straw, and packed it into wooden molds. They didn't just leave them to bake in the sun. They built kilns, great ovens that roared with heat, and they baked the bricks until they were hard as stone, impervious to water, uniform in size and shape. A fired brick is a predictable, reliable, permanent building block, and they found another gift from the earth, bitumen, sticky black asphalt that seeped from the ground in pits. It was a perfect, waterproof mortar, stronger and more resilient than simple mud. With fired bricks and bitumen mortar, they could build anything. They could build structures that would last for centuries. They could build something that they believed even a flood could not destroy. This new technology gave them a heady sense of power. They were no longer just survivors at the mercy of the elements. They were masters of their environment. Into this mix of fear, ingenuity, and burgeoning pride stepped a leader. His name was Nimrod, a great-grandson of the patriarch Noah. The scripture calls him a mighty hunter before the Lord, a phrase that hints at his power and charisma. He was a man of action, a tamer of the wild, a protector and a provider. He consolidated power and founded the first kingdom, with its center right there on the plains of Shinar, in a place called Babel. Nimrod was the man who gave voice to the people's unspoken fears and ambitions. We can imagine him, a powerful figure standing before the assembled clans, his voice booming across the plain. He would have spoken of their shared history, the terror of the flood. He would have praised their cleverness, their invention of the brick. And then he would have laid out his grand vision, a vision that promised them everything they craved: security, identity, and immortality. Come, he would have declared, his words echoing the communal chant of the brickmakers. Let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. The vision was twofold, a perfect expression of their fallen hearts. First, let us build ourselves a city. This was about security, a fortress, a place of strength, a center of commerce and culture, a place to gather and consolidate their power. It was a direct rejection of the nomadic, trust-based life God had intended for them. It was an attempt to control their own destiny. Second, and a tower with its top in the heavens. This was about pride. The phrase might not have meant a literal attempt to poke through the sky into God's dwelling place. It was a common figure of speech for immense height, but its purpose was clear. This would be a landmark, a monumental declaration of their own greatness. It would be a new kind of mountain, a man-made sacred peak that would draw all eyes and all worship to itself, and by extension, to its builders. It was to be their salvation, their focal point, their man-made tree of life. He gave them the reason, the driving motivation behind this colossal undertaking. "Let us make a name for ourselves," he would have roared, "lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth." There it is, the whole of the human condition in one sentence. The desperate, clawing need for fame, for significance, for a name that will outlast the fleeting breath of life. To be remembered, to matter. It is the cry of a creature who has forgotten that his name is already known and cherished by his Creator. And the fear, the deep, abiding fear of being scattered, of being lost and alone, of obeying God's command to go and fill the earth. They saw God's command not as a blessing, a chance to explore and steward a vast and beautiful world, but as a threat to their survival. The tower would be their anchor, a giant, defiant fist raised at the sky, declaring, "We will not be moved. We will not be scattered. We will stay here, and we will make our own name." The people were electrified. This was a vision they could all share, a project they could all contribute to. It gave their lives purpose, a purpose grander than simply surviving. They would be the generation that conquered the heavens, the generation that built a name for all time. And so, the great work began. It was the largest construction project the world had ever seen. The plains of Shinar became a hive of activity. The entire society was reoriented around the building of the city and its great tower, the ziggurat of Babel. Imagine the scene. Tens of thousands of people, all speaking one language, working in perfect, terrifying harmony. The air, once clear, became thick with the smoke from 1,000 kilns, burning day and night. The ground trembled with the constant movement of people, of carts laden with clay, of sledges dragging the finished bricks to the construction site. The sound was a symphony of industry. The rhythmic slap of clay into molds, the roar of the fires, the chipping of tools, the shouts of foremen, all of it forming a single, unified roar of human ambition. Let's picture a man, we'll call him Elam, a brickmaker. His day begins before dawn. He joins a long line of men digging clay from the riverbank, the wet, heavy earth clinging to his hands and feet. He carries the clay to the mixing pits, where it is trodden into a smooth paste. He spends his entire day at the molding table, packing the clay, leveling it, turning out brick after identical brick. His back aches, his hands are raw, but as he works, he glances over at the growing tower, a dark shape against the morning sky, and a surge of pride swells in his chest. He is not just making a brick. He is building a stairway to heaven. He is making a name for himself. His children's children will look at this tower and know that he, Elam, had a part in it. Now picture a woman, Mara, a water carrier. From dawn until dusk, she walks the path from the river to the kilns and the mortar pits, her shoulders straining under the weight of 2 heavy clay jars. The heat from the kilns is suffocating. The air is filled with acrid smoke, but she sees the tower growing and she feels safe. The tower is a shield. It is a wall against the chaos, against the memory of the floodwaters. As long as the tower stands, her family will be safe. They will not be scattered to the lonely corners of the earth. The tower is their promise, their security. And at the top of the chain is Nimrod, the architect of this grand design. He walks the site, a figure of immense power. He understands the logistics, the engineering. He directs the placement of the great ramps that spiral up the sides of the growing structure. He calculates the load-bearing capacity, the sheer number of bricks needed for the next level. He looks at the people working below him, a swarm of unified activity, and he feels like a god. He is not just building a tower. He is forging a new humanity, a single, powerful entity with himself at its head. The tower is not a stairway to God. It is a throne for man. Tower grew. Level by level, it rose from the flat plain, an artificial mountain of human pride. It was an incredible sight. Its base was a massive square, and it rose in a series of terraces, each one smaller than the one below it, with great staircases and ramps connecting them. The sheer scale of it was meant to inspire awe, to humble the individual before the power of the collective. It became the center of their lives. It was their economy, their culture, their religion. Their songs were about the tower. Their children's games were about building little towers of mud. Their prayers, if they still prayed, were likely directed not to the heavens, but to the growing edifice that they believed would soon touch them. They had forgotten the rainbow. They had forgotten the promise. They had put their faith not in the grace of God, but in the strength of their own baked bricks. Their unity, which could have been a great blessing, a source of mutual support and love, had become a tool for organized rebellion. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which the children of man had built. The gentle irony in that phrase is breathtaking. They thought their tower was reaching the heavens, a landmark visible from the edge of the world. But from a divine perspective, it was so insignificant, so pitiably small, that God had to come down just to get a good look at it. It was like a man stooping to examine a child's sandcastle on the beach. He saw the city, he saw the tower, and he saw their hearts. He saw that their unity was not a unity of love, but a unity of fear and pride. He saw their technological prowess being used not to serve, but to defy. And he spoke, not in anger, but in a kind of divine, diagnostic sorrow. Behold, they are one people, and they have all one language. And this is only the beginning of what they will do. He saw their trajectory. He saw that this tower was not the culmination of their ambition, but merely the first step. With this level of unity and technological skill, divorced from any moral or spiritual anchor, there was no limit to the evil they could accomplish, and nothing that they proposed to do will now be impossible for them. It was not a statement of fear, as if God were threatened by their power. It was a statement of fact about human nature. Unified, godless humanity, with its ever-increasing technological power, would inevitably lead itself to self-destruction. Their project to save themselves would, in the end, be the very thing that destroyed them. An act of judgment was necessary, but it was a judgment tempered with a strange mercy. He did not send a flood he had promised not to. He did not send fire and brimstone. He did something far more subtle and, in a way, far more profound. He targeted the very source of their power, their unity. Come, let us go down, and there confuse their language, so that they may not understand one another's speech. It didn't happen with a thunderclap. There was no visible spectacle. It simply happened. Imagine Elam, the brickmaker, again. He has just finished loading a sledge with a new batch of perfectly fired bricks. He calls out to his partner, a man he has worked beside for years. The bricks are ready. Bring the sledge. But the words that come out of his mouth are not the words he intended. They are a jumble of new sounds, new cadences. His partner looks at him, his face a mask of confusion, and responds in a third set of sounds, gesturing angrily at the sledge. Elam has no idea what he is saying. He tries again, shouting the same command, but the same alien sounds emerge. Fear begins to prickle his skin. Is his friend mocking him? Has he gone mad? Imagine Mara, the water carrier. She arrives at the mortar pit and says to the mixer, "Here is your water." He stares at her blankly, then turns to his coworker and speaks, and the sounds that come from his mouth are utterly foreign to her. She thinks they are insulting her, conspiring against her. She drops her jars and backs away, her heart pounding. Imagine Nimrod standing on the 5th terrace, looking down at his perfect, well-oiled machine. He shouts a command to a team of engineers below, but they just stare up at him, uncomprehending. He bellows the command again, his voice cracking with frustration. They shout back, but their words are a meaningless babble. Chaos begins to erupt below. Teams that used to work in seamless unison are now shoving and yelling at each other. A scaffold collapses because one team didn't understand the warning from another. Fights are breaking out. The symphony of industry has become a terrifying cacophony of confusion. The project ground to a halt, not because of a lack of materials, or a failure of engineering, or an invading army. It stopped because a bricklayer could no longer ask for mortar. An architect could no longer explain a design. A foreman could no longer give a command. The very tool that had enabled their proud rebellion, their single language, was now the agent of their dissolution. Their unity, built on the sand of human pride, shattered into 1,000 pieces. Suspicion replaced cooperation. Fear replaced confidence. People began to cluster with the few others who, by some strange miracle, spoke this new, strange tongue that they now spoke. An invisible wall had been erected between them, more impassable than any wall of brick. They looked at the tower, this half-finished monument to their arrogance, and they no longer saw a symbol of their glory. They saw a symbol of their folly, their failure. It was a place of confusion, of babbling, a place of Babel. There was nothing left to do. They abandoned the city. They abandoned the tower. In small, frightened, angry groups, united only by their new, limited languages, they did the very thing they had built the tower to prevent. They scattered. They moved away from Shinar, away from each other, across the face of the whole earth. They went north, south, east, and west to fill the earth as God had commanded from the beginning. The great tower was left to the wind and the rain, a silent, crumbling testament to humanity's most catastrophic mistake of collective pride. They had tried to make a name for themselves, and in the end, all they had made was a mess. They had sought to anchor themselves in one place, and in the end, they were scattered to every corner of the globe. Their shared voice broken into 1,000 different tongues, a permanent reminder of the day they tried to build their own way to heaven and found it led only to confusion. The world after Babel was a world of echoes and murmurs. The single, proud voice of humanity shattered on the plains of Shinar was now a diaspora of whispers, 1,000 different tongues telling 1,000 different stories, all carrying a faint, ancestral memory of a shared home and a shared failure. Humanity scattered, just as God had commanded, but they did so in confusion and strife, not in joyful exploration. They filled the earth, but their hearts were filled with suspicion for anyone whose speech was not their own. Civilizations rose and fell. In that same fertile crescent, not far from the crumbling ruins of Nimrod's folly, a great city called Ur of the Chaldees grew powerful. It was a city of impressive ziggurats, not unlike the one at Babel, dedicated to a pantheon of gods, most notably the god of the moon. And it was here, in the midst of this sophisticated, idolatrous culture, that God chose to begin again, not with all of humanity, but with one man. His name was Abram. He was a descendant of Shem, Noah's faithful son. God spoke to him, not with a confusing babble, but with a clear, life-altering command and a staggering promise. Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great. It was the antithesis of the Babel project. The people at Babel had said, "Let us make a name for ourselves." God now said to Abram, "I will make your name great." Their greatness was to be built on brick and bitumen. Abram was to be built on faith and promise. And Abram went. He and his wife Sarai began a journey of faith that would become the foundation for a people. Through their son Isaac and his son Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel, the family grew into 12 tribes. But a great famine drove them down into the rich, well-watered land of Egypt, a nation whose power and pantheon of animal-headed gods were even more impressive than those of Ur. They were welcomed at first, thanks to the wisdom of Jacob's son, Joseph. But generations passed. The favor they had enjoyed curdled into fear. The Egyptians saw this prolific, distinct people growing in their midst and enslaved them. For 400 years, the children of Israel labored under the lash. They built the great treasure cities of Pithom and Ramesses for a pharaoh who did not know Joseph. Their lives were bitter with hard service in mortar and brick, the very materials of their ancestors' rebellion now becoming the substance of their oppression. Their cries of anguish went up to heaven, and God heard them. He remembered his promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He called another man, a man named Moses, who had been raised in Pharaoh's court, but was born a Hebrew. From a bush that burned, but was not consumed in the desolate wilderness of Midian, God sent him back to Egypt to deliver his people. And what a deliverance it was. The people at the foot of the mountain had not just heard stories of God's power, they had seen it firsthand in the most spectacular and terrifying ways imaginable. They had watched as Moses and his brother Aaron confronted the mightiest man on earth, the Pharaoh, who was considered a god himself. They had seen the Nile River, the lifeblood of Egypt, turn to blood. They had felt the land crawl with frogs, swarm with gnats and flies. They had seen the livestock of the Egyptians die, while their own were untouched. They had cowered in their huts as boils afflicted their masters. They had watched in awe as a storm of fire and hail destroyed the crops of Egypt again, leaving their own lands in Goshen unscathed. They had witnessed a darkness so profound, so thick it could be felt, smothering the sun-worshipping Egyptians for 3 days, while light shone in their own homes. And finally, the most terrible and intimate miracle of all, the Passover. They had huddled in their homes, the blood of a perfect lamb smeared on their doorposts, while the angel of death passed through the land, taking the firstborn of every Egyptian household, from the son of Pharaoh on his throne to the son of the maidservant at her mill. They had heard the great cry of grief from their oppressors, and then they had been set free, laden with the gold and silver of the Egyptians, who were desperate to see them go. Their liberation was not a quiet negotiation. It was a cosmic, supernatural triumph. Their journey out of Egypt was guided by God himself, a pillar of cloud by day to shade them from the brutal desert sun, and a pillar of fire by night to give them light and warmth. When Pharaoh's army, the most fearsome fighting force in the world, pursued them to the banks of the Red Sea, they were trapped. Despair seized them. Is it because there are no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? They cried to Moses, their first of many complaints. Their memory of God's power, it seems, was terrifyingly short. But Moses stretched out his hand, and God drove the sea back with a strong east wind all night, turning the sea into dry land. They walked through the heart of the sea, on a path paved by divine power, with a wall of water on their right and on their left. It must have been the most terrifying and exhilarating walk in human history. The sound of the water held at bay, the salty spray on their faces, the seabed firm beneath their feet. When the Egyptian army charged after them into that same path, the walls of water collapsed, and the entire army was drowned. The Israelites, standing safe on the other side, saw the bodies of their former masters washed up on the shore. They had been saved, utterly and completely. You would think, wouldn't you, that a people who had witnessed such things would be unshakable in their faith. You would think that their trust in this God of wonders would be absolute. But the human heart is a fickle, forgetful thing. 3 days later, in the wilderness, they found no water, and the murmuring began again. "What shall we drink?" they grumbled. God led them to the bitter waters of Marah and showed Moses a log to throw into the water, which miraculously became sweet. A little further on, their food ran out. "Would that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt," they wailed, "when we sat by the meat pots and ate bread to the full." They romanticized their slavery, remembering the food and forgetting the whips. In response, God gave them manna, a mysterious, sweet, bread-like substance that appeared with the dew every morning. And when they tired of that, He sent a wind that brought clouds of quail into their camp. At Rephidim, there was no water again, and again they quarreled with Moses, on the verge of stoning him. God commanded Moses to strike a rock at Horeb, and water gushed forth for the entire nation to drink. Miracle after miracle was met with amnesia and complaint. Their slave mentality was deeply ingrained. They were a people traumatized, accustomed to tangible masters and visible gods. This invisible God who led them with cloud and fire was powerful, yes, but also frighteningly abstract. They were like children, utterly dependent, yet constantly chafing against their parent. This was the state of the people when they arrived at the foot of Mount Sinai. They had been out of Egypt for 3 months. They were a nation of perhaps 2 million souls, a sprawling, chaotic camp at the base of a stark, granite mountain that jutted out of the desert floor. Here, God proposed something revolutionary. He was going to make a covenant with them, a formal treaty. He would be their God, and they would be His treasured possession, a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. The people, still awed by their recent deliverance, readily agreed. "All that the Lord has spoken, we will do," they promised. To ratify this covenant, God Himself descended upon the mountain, and it was the most terrifying event they had ever experienced, more terrifying than the plagues or the drowning of Pharaoh's army. For 3 days, they consecrated themselves, washing their clothes, preparing to meet their king. On the 3rd day, the mountain began to tremble. A thick cloud enveloped the peak. There was thunder that rattled their bones and lightning that tore the sky apart. The whole mountain was wrapped in smoke, as if it were a gigantic furnace, because the Lord had descended upon it in fire. And then came a sound, the sound of a ram's horn, a shofar that grew louder and louder and louder, until it was an unbearable, world-filling blast. The people standing at the foot of the mountain were undone by sheer terror. They trembled violently. This was not a comforting presence. This was undiluted, unmediated holiness, and they felt their own sinfulness, their own mortality, as a fragile, flimsy thing in the face of it. When God began to speak the 10 Commandments from the heart of the fire, they could not bear it. They shrank back. They cried out to Moses, "You speak to us, and we will listen. But do not let God speak to us, lest we die." It was a pivotal moment. They willingly, eagerly placed a mediator between themselves and God. They did not want that kind of direct relationship with this terrifyingly holy being. They wanted a buffer. Moses, their familiar leader, was their chosen representative. So Moses drew near to the thick darkness where God was, and the people remained at a distance. Moses went up and down the mountain, relaying God's laws and ordinances. He built an altar, sacrificed oxen, and sprinkled their blood, the blood of the covenant, on the people, sealing the deal. And once more, the people affirmed their loyalty. "All that the Lord has said, we will do, and we will be obedient." Then God called Moses to the top of the mountain one more time. "Come up to me on the mountain and wait there, that I may give you the tablets of stone with the law and the commandment, which I have written for their instruction." Moses, along with his aide Joshua, went up into the cloud that covered the mountain. He would be gone for 40 days and 40 nights. 40 days. It doesn't sound like much to us, perhaps. Here in Da Nang, the night is settling in, and tomorrow will come, and the day after. We are used to waiting. We wait for the seasons to change, for a pot of water to boil, for a traffic light to turn green. But for the Israelites at the foot of that smoking mountain, it was an eternity. For the first few days, there was probably an air of anticipation. They watched the cloud on the mountain, the fire that still glowed within it, and they waited for Moses to return with the very handwriting of God. But a week passed. Then, too, the daily routine of collecting manna became monotonous. The initial terror of the theophany began to fade, replaced by the mundane realities of desert life: the heat, the boredom, the crying of children. By the third week, the anxiety began to creep in. Where was Moses? The mountain was still smoking, but there was no sign of him. Had he been consumed by the fire? Had God, in his terrifying holiness, destroyed him? The pillar of cloud that had guided them was now stationary on the mountain peak. They were rudderless, a vast ship of people moored in a sea of sand, and their captain was missing. By the fourth week, anxiety curdled into panic. The tribal elders began to confer, their faces etched with worry. The murmuring started again, a low hum of fear that quickly swelled into a roar of collective terror. "This Moses," they said, "the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him." Notice how they distanced themselves from him. Not our leader Moses, but this Moses. He was no longer one of them. He was the man who had brought them to this desolate place and abandoned them. Their slave mentality, never far from the surface, reasserted itself with a vengeance. In Egypt, they had gods they could see: Apis the bull, Hathor the cow. Gods of wood and stone and metal, gods you could carry in a procession. Gods who didn't disappear into a cloud on a terrifying mountain for 40 days. They needed something tangible. They needed a God who would go before them, a God they could see and control. Their fear of the invisible God was greater than their fear of idolatry. The mob, now a torrent of panic, surged towards the tent of Aaron, Moses' brother, the one left in charge. They surrounded him, their faces wild with fear and desperation. "Up," they shouted, their voices a single, demanding roar. "Make us gods who shall go before us." Aaron, poor Aaron. He was not a wicked man at heart, but he was a weak one. He was not a leader like his brother, he was a spokesman. He was a pleaser. Faced with this angry, terrified mob, he crumbled. He didn't reason with them. He didn't remind them of the pillar of fire, the manna, the water from the rock. He didn't point to the smoking mountain and remind them of their promise. All that the Lord has said, we will do. He saw the fury in their eyes, and he capitulated completely. Perhaps he thought he could control the situation, give them a symbol that he could later claim represented Yahweh. It was a disastrous miscalculation. He gave them a command that should have choked him. "Take off the rings of gold that are in the ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring them to me." This was the very gold they had been given by the Egyptians on the night of their liberation. The gold that was a symbol of their redemption, of God's victory over their enemies. Now, they were to use it to fashion an idol, and they did it eagerly. They stripped the jewelry from their ears, the trinkets of their slavery that had become the tokens of their freedom, and brought them to Aaron. A great pile of gold, gleaming in the desert sun. Aaron took the gold, a mountain of misdirected devotion. He melted it down in a crucible, the precious metal turning to a molten, glowing liquid. Then he poured it into a mold, and with a craftsman's engraving tool, he fashioned it into the shape of a young bull, a calf, a golden calf. It was a direct import from Egypt, a symbol of strength and fertility, the very kind of idol they had just been freed from. He held it up for the people to see. The golden calf, gleaming, solid, and silent. And a great collective sigh of relief went through the camp. Here was a God they could understand, a God that didn't speak in terrifying thunder, a God that didn't demand a holy lifestyle, a God that didn't vanish for 40 days. Then Aaron, in a moment of catastrophic spiritual blindness, sealed the betrayal. He built an altar before the calf and made a proclamation. "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." It was the ultimate blasphemy. He attributed the miraculous, history-altering work of the one true God, the plagues, the Passover, the parting of the sea to this lump of inanimate metal. And the people, their memories now completely erased, their fear now channeled into false worship, roared their approval. Aaron, digging the hole deeper, declared, "Tomorrow shall be a feast to the Lord." He tried to syncretize, to blend the worship of this idol with the worship of Yahweh, as if God would be pleased with such a thing. The next day, the camp erupted in a frenzy of pagan celebration. They rose early, brought burnt offerings and peace offerings to the golden calf. And then, the scripture says, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. This was not innocent fun and games. This was a revel, a wild, orgiastic festival of the kind that was common in pagan fertility cults. It was a complete moral and spiritual regression. They were dancing, singing, and debauching themselves before a golden idol at the very foot of the mountain, where the presence of the holy God of the universe still burned. It was an act of adultery on a national scale, a people cheating on their divine husband at the very moment their marriage contract was being written in stone, while this carnival of apostasy was raging in the valley. A very different conversation was happening on the peak. God spoke to Moses, his voice no longer the calm tone of a lawgiver, but the searing fire of a betrayed husband. "Go down," he said to Moses, "for your people, whom you brought up out of the land of Egypt, have corrupted themselves." God, in his anger, distances himself from them. "They are no longer my people, but your people, Moses. They have turned aside quickly out of the way that I commanded them. They have made for themselves a golden calf and have worshipped it. And behold, it is a stiff-necked people. The divine judgment was swift and terrible. Now therefore let me alone, that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them. And of you I will make a great nation." God offered Moses the deal of a lifetime to wipe the slate clean, destroy this rebellious nation, and start over with Moses as the new Abraham. But Moses, in this moment, showed his true greatness. He was not a weak pleaser like his brother. He was a true shepherd, a fierce advocate for his flawed and foolish flock. He began to intercede, to plead with God. He didn't make excuses for the people. He simply appealed to God's own character and reputation. "O Lord, why does your wrath burn hot against your people?" he began. He reminded God that these were the people he had brought out of Egypt with great power. What would the Egyptians say if God destroyed them now? They would say he brought them out to the wilderness just to kill them. He appealed to God's reputation among the nations. Then he appealed to God's faithfulness to his own promises, reminding him of the covenant he had sworn to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And the Lord relented. He turned from the disaster he had threatened to bring upon his people. Moses' love for his people had, in a way, saved them. Carrying the two precious tablets of stone, tablets written on both sides by the very finger of God, Moses began his descent, with Joshua by his side. As they got halfway down the mountain, they began to hear the noise from the camp below. Joshua, the soldier, heard it first. "There is a noise of war in the camp," he said. But Moses, his heart already heavy with God's words, knew better. "It is not the sound of shouting for victory, or the sound of the cry of defeat," he said, his voice grim, "but the sound of singing that I hear." He rounded a rocky outcrop, and the whole scene came into view. The sprawling camp, and in its center, the fire, the altar, the gleaming golden calf, and the people, his people, dancing and singing in a wild, drunken revelry. The sight shattered him. The full weight of their betrayal, their stupidity, their ingratitude, hit him with the force of a physical blow. A holy fury, A righteous anger that was a faint echo of God's own wrath surged through him. His hands, which had so carefully carried the sacred law, now trembled with rage. He lifted the 2 stone tablets high above his head, the physical manifestation of the covenant, the marriage contract, and he hurled them down at the foot of the mountain. They shattered into 100 pieces. It was a perfectly symbolic act. The people had broken the covenant in their hearts, so Moses broke its symbol before their eyes. The party came to a sudden, shocked halt. The singing died in their throats. The dancing stopped. All eyes turned to Moses, his face terrible in its anger, standing amidst the fragments of the law, the smoking, holy mountain at his back. The catastrophic mistake was complete, and the dreadful reckoning was about to begin. The echoes of Sinai, of shattered laws and a broken covenant, reverberated through the centuries. Israel's history became a long, sorrowful poem written in a repeating rhythm of sin, suffering, supplication, and salvation. They wandered in the desert for 40 years, an entire generation paying the price for the faithlessness born at the foot of the mountain, until they finally entered the promised land. The period of the Judges was a dark, chaotic time, a testament to the truth that when everyone does what is right in their own eyes, the result is not freedom, but anarchy and bloodshed. They cried out for a king, wanting to be like the other nations, rejecting God's direct rule for the tangible authority of a man on a throne. God gave them a king, Saul, whose reign ended in madness and tragedy. He was followed by David, the shepherd king, a man after God's own heart, yet also a man of catastrophic personal failings. His son, Solomon, built a magnificent temple and led the kingdom to its golden age, only to have his heart turned away by foreign wives and their foreign gods, sowing the seeds of the nation's undoing. After Solomon, the kingdom ripped in two. The history of the divided kingdoms of Israel and Judah is a dreary tale of idolatry, corruption, and prophetic warnings largely ignored. One by one, they fell to the great empires of the age. The northern kingdom was scattered by the Assyrians, its 10 tribes lost to history. The southern kingdom of Judah, with its holy city Jerusalem and its glorious temple, was eventually crushed by the Babylonians. The city was razed, the temple destroyed, and the people, the remnant of the promise, were dragged off into exile to weep by the waters of Babylon, having lost everything. After generations in a foreign land, a remnant was allowed to return. They rebuilt the city and a humbler second temple, but they were no longer a sovereign power. They were a province, a vassal state, living under the shadow of one empire after another. Persia, Greece, and finally, the iron fist of Rome. It was into this world, a world of heavy taxes, Roman legions marching through their streets, and a deep, aching spiritual hunger, that the hope for a Messiah burned its brightest. For centuries, the prophets had spoken of a coming king, an anointed one from the line of David who would restore the kingdom. But the people, in their suffering, had edited the prophecies in their hearts. They longed for a warrior king, a political revolutionary, a new David who would take up the sword, drive out the Romans, and make Israel great again. They scanned the horizon for a conqueror, a zealot, a man of power. And so, when Jesus of Nazareth appeared, preaching a message of repentance, love for one's enemies, and a kingdom that was not of this world, it was both intoxicating and deeply confusing. He came from a backwater town, an artisan's son, with no political connections or military training. Yet he spoke with an authority they had never heard, and he performed miracles that defied belief. He healed the sick, gave sight to the blind, commanded the storms, and even raised the dead. He gathered around him a strange, motley crew of 12 men to be his closest companions. They were not the powerful or the learned. They were fishermen, a despised tax collector, a political zealot, and others of humble origin. They were a microcosm of the nation itself, flawed, hopeful, and prone to misunderstanding. And among them was a man named Judas, from the town of Kirioth in Judea. This made him unique. He was the only one of the 12 who was not a Galilean. Perhaps he was more sophisticated, more worldly, more attuned to the political currents of the capital, Jerusalem. What drew Judas to follow this Nazarene carpenter? We can only wonder. Did he see the raw power in Jesus' miracles and believe this was the man who could lead the rebellion? Did he hear the crowds murmur that this might be the one and decide to attach himself to a rising star? Or was there, at the beginning, a flicker of genuine faith, a hope for spiritual renewal that was slowly choked out by other, darker ambitions? We don't know. What we do know is that he was accepted, welcomed into the inner circle. He was trusted, so trusted, in fact, that he was made the keeper of their common purse, their treasurer. It was a practical job for a practical man, a role that required a head for numbers and a steady hand. He was the one who managed their meager funds, doling out money for food and lodging, and giving to the poor. He was an apostle, an eyewitness to the resurrection of Jairus' daughter, a participant in the feeding of the 5,000. He walked, ate, and lived with the living God for 3 years, and saw things that kings and prophets had longed to see. But somewhere along the way, a seed of disillusionment began to grow in Judas's practical heart. This Jesus was not behaving like a proper Messiah. He had the power, yes, but he refused to use it in the way Judas thought he should. After he miraculously fed 5,000 men and their families with just a few loaves and fishes, the crowd was ready to take him by force and make him king. This was the moment. This was the turning point Judas had been waiting for. But Jesus, seeing their intent, slipped away from them, escaping to a mountain by himself. He rejected the crown. For a man like Judas, who may have seen this movement in political terms, this must have been maddeningly frustrating. It was a squandered opportunity. Then came Jesus' strange, difficult teachings. He started talking about being the bread of life, and that people must eat his flesh and drink his blood. It was deeply unsettling language, and many of his followers couldn't stomach it. They grumbled, "This is a hard saying, who can listen to it?" And they turned back and no longer walked with him. Jesus, seeing them go, turned to the 12 and asked, "Do you want to go away as well?" It was Peter who answered for them all, "Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life." We can imagine Judas standing there silent, his heart troubled. Did he want to go? Perhaps. But where else was there? He had invested 3 years of his life in this. He was in too deep to leave, but the doubts were festering. The breaking point seems to have come just a week before the end in the town of Bethany. They were having dinner at the house of Simon the leper, and Mary, the sister of Lazarus, whom Jesus had raised from the dead, did an extraordinary thing. She took a pound of incredibly expensive ointment, pure nard, worth a year's wages for a common laborer, and she anointed Jesus' feet with it, wiping them with her hair. The fragrance of the perfume filled the entire house. It was an act of extravagant, reckless, beautiful love, but Judas did not see it that way. His practical, treasurer's mind saw only waste. Why was this ointment not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor? He asked, his voice sharp with criticism. It sounded pious, a concern for the poor. But the scripture tells us his heart. He said this, not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief, and having charge of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. His heart had grown a shell of cynicism. The love and wonder had been replaced by a bookkeeper's cold calculation. But it was likely more than just greed. It was the culmination of his frustration. Here was Jesus, on the brink of what should have been his triumphant entry into Jerusalem, allowing this absurd waste of resources. 300 denarii could have funded their cause for months, bribed officials, bought supplies. Instead, it was being wiped away on his feet. It was the act of a mystic, not a king, a poet, not a revolutionary. Jesus' reply was a gentle rebuke, but for Judas, it must have felt like a dismissal. "Leave her alone," Jesus said. "The poor you will always have with you, but you will not always have me." In that moment, Judas may have realized that his vision for the movement and Jesus' vision were irreconcilably different. He was following the wrong Messiah. His investment had soured. And if he couldn't get a kingdom out of it, perhaps he could at least get some money. The love of money, the scripture says, is a root of all kinds of evil. In Judas's heart, it had grown into a monstrous tree. It was then, the Bible says, that Satan entered into him. This was not a sudden, monstrous possession. It was the final surrender. For 3 years, a battle had been waged in Judas's soul between faith and doubt, between hope and ambition, between love and greed. Now, the battle was over. He had made his choice. He had opened the door of his heart, and the darkness rushed in. He left Bethany and walked the few miles to Jerusalem, his mind set. He went not to the temple to pray, but to the chambers of the chief priests, the very men who were plotting to kill Jesus. They were powerful, wealthy men, and they were afraid of Jesus. He was a threat to their authority and their cozy relationship with the Romans. They wanted him gone, but they were afraid to arrest him publicly because of the crowds. Imagine the scene. Judas, one of the 12, an insider, appears before them. It must have been a stunning development. Their problem had just solved itself. Here was a traitor willing to deliver his master into their hands. "What will you give me if I deliver him to you?" Judas asked. The question is chilling in its bald commercialism. He was no longer a disciple. He was a contractor negotiating a fee. They weighed out 30 pieces of silver. 30 pieces. The price specified in the law of Moses as the compensation for a slave who had been gored by an ox. It was a contemptuously small sum, the price of damaged property. It was all they thought his master was worth, and Judas, in his brokenness, agreed. He took the money, the cold, heavy coins pressing into his palm. The deal was done. From that moment on, he looked for an opportunity to betray him. The opportunity came a few nights later. It was the Passover, the most sacred festival, celebrating Israel's liberation from slavery in Egypt. And Jesus was celebrating it with his disciples in a secret upper room in Jerusalem. The atmosphere must have been thick with tension. Jesus knew what was coming. Judas knew what he was about to do. As they ate, Jesus did something shocking. He rose from the table, took off his outer garment, wrapped a towel around his waist, and began to wash the disciples' feet. It was the job of the lowest slave. He moved around the room, washing the dirt and grime from the feet of these men who had followed him. He washed Peter's feet. He washed John's feet. And then he came to Judas. He knelt before the man who had already sold him, and he washed his feet. He looked up at his betrayer, his hands gently washing away the dust of the road that Judas had walked to make his treacherous deal. What did Judas feel in that moment? A flash of shame, a flicker of doubt, or was his heart already as cold as the silver in his purse? They returned to the table, and Jesus, his voice heavy with sorrow, made a stunning announcement. "Truly, I say to you, one of you will betray me." A wave of shock and confusion went through the room. One of them, impossible. They began to look at each other, their faces filled with distress. "Is it I, Lord?" they asked, one after another. They were searching their own hearts, horrified at the possibility. And then Judas, his voice perhaps a hollow whisper, asked the same question. "Is it I, Rabbi?" Jesus' reply was quiet, devastating, and for Judas's ears only. "You have said so." And then, a little louder for all to hear, Jesus said, "What you are about to do, do quickly." Was a dismissal, a release. The other disciples didn't understand. They thought Jesus was sending Judas, the treasurer, out to buy something for the feast or to give something to the poor. But Judas understood. He got up from the table, his face a mask. He walked out of the warm, lamplit room, out of the circle of fellowship, and into the darkness. And the scripture adds a final, chilling note. And it was night. It was night in the city of Jerusalem, and it was night in the soul of Judas Iscariot. Jesus led the remaining 11 disciples out of the city, across the Kidron Valley, to a place they often went to pray. A garden of ancient olive trees on the Mount of Olives called Gethsemane. He was in agony, his soul very sorrowful, even to death. He pleaded with his Father, "If it is possible, let this cup pass from me, nevertheless, not as I will, as you will." While he was praying, Judas arrived. He was not alone. He was leading a large detachment of temple guards and Roman soldiers, armed with swords and clubs, carrying lanterns and torches that cut through the darkness of the garden. He had led them here, to this quiet place of prayer, knowing Jesus would be here, away from the crowds. He had arranged a signal with them, a signal that was a masterpiece of perverse intimacy. "The one I will kiss is the man, seize him." A kiss, the greeting of a student to a beloved rabbi, a sign of affection and respect, twisted into an act of betrayal. Judas walked ahead of the soldiers into the small circle of light cast by their torches. He approached Jesus, who stood to meet him, calm and unafraid. "Greetings, Rabbi," Judas said, and he kissed him. For a moment, the world must have stood still. The creator of the universe betrayed with a kiss by one of his own creatures in a garden, just as humanity's fall had begun in a garden. Jesus looked at him, not with anger, but with a look of profound, heartbreaking sorrow. "Friend," he said, the word a gentle lance in Judas's heart, "do what you came to do." The soldiers moved in, seizing Jesus. The disciples, in a moment of panic, scattered and fled into the darkness, just as Jesus had predicted. Peter drew a sword and cut off a man's ear, but Jesus healed him, his last act of miraculous mercy before his arrest. And then he was led away, a prisoner, to the house of the high priest to face a sham trial. Judas was left standing in the garden alone. The soldiers were gone. Jesus was gone. The other disciples were gone. There was only the flickering torchlight, the rustle of the ancient olive leaves, and the 30 pieces of silver in his purse, now feeling impossibly heavy, impossibly cold. The catastrophic mistake was complete. Cain's envy had murdered one man. The pride of Babel had scattered a generation. The impatience of Israel had forged a dead idol. But Judas's betrayal, born of greed and disillusionment, had handed the Son of God himself over to be killed. When he saw that Jesus was condemned, a sudden, horrifying wave of remorse crashed over him. He realized the finality of what he had done. He had not just handed over a failed revolutionary, he had betrayed innocent blood. He ran back to the chief priests, the silver clutched in his hand. "I have sinned by betraying innocent blood," he cried, his voice ragged with despair. But they were done with him. He had served his purpose. "What is that to us?" they sneered. "See to it yourself." The money was worthless to him now. In a final, desperate act of repudiation, he threw the 30 silver coins down onto the floor of the temple sanctuary, the holy place. The coins skittered across the marble, a clattering, mocking sound in the sacred silence. He turned and fled, a man utterly undone, consumed by a guilt so vast, so absolute, that he could see no possibility of forgiveness. He had walked and talked with forgiveness incarnate for 3 years, yet in the end, he could not believe it was for him. He went out, and in his despair, he hanged himself, his act of betrayal, the culmination of 1,000 small surrenders of the heart, set in motion the events that would lead to the cross. It was a catastrophic mistake that changed the world forever, not by thwarting God's plan, but by becoming the dark, terrible, and necessary pivot upon which the door of salvation would ultimately swing open for all of humanity. It was the final, tragic lesson that even the most catastrophic of human mistakes can be redeemed and overcome by a divine love that is willing to be broken.